Hello. From porn to Tibetan monasteries, quite a jump, but anyway. So I'm Rinchen, and I was asked here by Matt when we discussed my project, the photo book Kham. And before I talk about the project itself, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about my family and my connection to the work. So my father was born in 1933 in Kham, which is in the east of Tibet, and it's now the Qinghai province of China, and this is him aged 18. Before he was born, a monk came to my grandparents' house and basically said to my grandmother that she was carrying the 8th incarnation of the Tenzing Tuku, which is a reincarnation of a Tibetan spiritual leader. And she asked how he knew it was a boy, but basically he was, and age 7 he went to the monastery for his formal religious teaching. This photograph's quite exciting because we found it a couple of years ago, and we think it's a photograph of my grandfather. He's in the front row on the furthest to me, closest to me on the right. And my dad was one of 11, and my grandfather was the head of an area within Kham. And if you fast forward 20 years, with the arrival of the People's Liberation Army of China, my father, who was studying in Lhasa, escaped to India. But because of my grandfather's position and the communist abolition of the Tibetan feudal system, my family was focused on more than others. And of 11 brothers and sisters, only my dad and 2 sisters survived. So here's a picture of Dad with 2 of his brothers. There's only 3 photographs of my dad and none of my grandmother and the other aunts and uncles. So these photographs are really precious. It's partly because photography was really rare. You basically would just have your photograph taken in a photo studio with these incredible painted backdrops. But also a lot was destroyed during the difficult times. And the only reason we have these photographs is because a loyal family friend buried them with other religious contraband, and he buried them under his dog's kennel. And I think the army just gave the dogs a swerve because Tibetan guard dogs are notoriously ferocious. So they managed to survive, and when my dad came back in the 80s, he presented them to him. So it was really, really precious to us. Just so you have an idea of how remote it is, when I first went back when I was 7, when the borders reopened, we flew into Beijing, and there was so we flew into Beijing, and then 3 days by train, 4 days by jeep, a day by lorry, and then 10 hours by horseback to get home. So it was obviously very remote. That's me looking cool on the train. And having done this journey with my kids, I'm massively respectful to my parents because it's quite an epic trip. So I started shooting in earnest when I was around 17, and as a graduate I had dreams of being a photojournalist, a really gritty, serious photojournalist like Dorothea Lange or Don McCullum, and I'm predominantly an analog photographer. It's not that I'm against digital, it definitely has its place, but I find it just can't handle the high altitude light, and there's something about the blacks of the shadows and the super bright highlights that it just doesn't do it justice. And I've also shot on a Hasselblad for so long now, I kind of see in squares, which is handy for Instagram, obviously. One of the beautiful things about shooting on a Hasselblad is that when you're shooting a portrait, once you've focused the shot, you can look up and engage with your subject. And photography is a really intrusive act, like no one really wants a camera. Well, I definitely don't want a camera put in my face, and I feel like meeting their eyes, you create like a contract with your subject, and you create a feeling of trust, and somehow that subject is allowing you to take the picture. And with this act, the subject is often much more responsive, and you kind of give them control of that moment, and I think it leads to a more genuine shot, or a more acceptable shot in a way. So when I was asked when I was growing up where I was from, if I said I was half Tibetan, I would get one of 2 responses. One would be that people just didn't know where Tibet was. And the other one would be, oh, Tibet's so amazing and beautiful, and all the people are so wonderful and smiley. Which is obviously quite a weird concept because a whole nation of people aren't wonderful and smiley and lovely. So one thing I'm really aware of is that the Tibetan communities have been shot a lot by Western and Chinese photographers, and they're often cast in this very romantic light, sort of foreign or other. And for me, it's really important that in my work it's seen differently from that, like a Tibetan shooting in Tibet. And it's my very small attempt at sort of decolonizing the photography in Tibet, because I want to show it for how it is genuinely. I still want it to be beautiful, and yes, it is sometimes very romantic, but I just want to try and present it for how it is. So this is an image from the project Rising Sun, which during the Cultural Revolution, people weren't allowed religious iconography, like I said before, so they would hide statues, and a lot was destroyed, and hide the photography, like my dad's photo. And so they replaced these shrines and the religious imagery with pictures of Chairman Mao. And it was a bit like a show of support, an insurance policy, but also it's now kind of become part of the culture. It's become a tradition. So now you're allowed shrines and religious iconography, but they still have these pictures in their houses, a bit like an iconographic hangover. So one thing I've really struggled with in my work is to address the things that happen during the difficult times, because they're just best not shared. Talking could be troublesome for my family, or it could mean that I wasn't granted access to return, and obviously that's it's most important for me that I get to return to see my family, so my photography had to work with that. So how do I approach this and still address them without kind of causing offence? I really want my work to hold a meaning, but not like an overt message, and it's not that I don't want my work to be beautiful, like I said, but for the beauty to act a bit like a smoke screen for the message, and the audience has to work a bit, has to like understand a little bit more about the subject and to engage with it to get the most out of it. On a side note, this is one of my favourite pictures from last year, and it's one of the reasons why I love analogue, because you might take a photograph and you think, this is the shot of my career, and the light's incredible and it's amazing, and you get the contact sheet back and you're like, oh, this is so disappointing. And then other times, on the flip side, you'll get a shot back that you think was just nothing, and actually it becomes one of your favourites. So it's always exciting when you shoot with film, because you never really know what you're going to get. So going back to my desire of being a photojournalist, this project was taken in the aftermath of a huge earthquake in 2010. The town was totally obliterated. It was like, my friend described it like a teacup falling off a table. It was over in seconds and then just leaving shattered pieces behind. And the official death toll was 2,698, but they believe it was more like 20,000. So families and businesses were moved to these relief tents that you can see in the left-hand side, which were adequate when I visited in summer, and luckily being a nomadic people adjusted. But the weather's really extreme and it goes down to -20, so you can imagine it was quite a difficult time. And it took 2 years to remodel and rebuild the town, so it was quite big. So this could have been that series. You know, we had friends coming to see my dad in a religious sense and trying to find that solace. And I had a friend who lost both her parents, her partner, and her child. And it could have been that series where I shot those really strong photojournalistic images which were filled with grief and pain, but I just couldn't do it. I just didn't have it in me, and because they were my friends and my family, and it just I couldn't remain detached, and I couldn't turn my camera on them, so I kind of felt like I'd have been complicit in their pain, even though obviously it's a really important thing to have talked about. So instead, I wandered around the area, and I focused on the fabric of the land. And I'm not a landscape photographer, but I felt like that's the only thing I could really work with at that time. And so I worked often at night. My cousin would drive me around, and we'd find all these places. And I photographed the landscapes with this long exposures and low light. So again, on the surface, these are aesthetically pleasing, or I hope they are. And but when you understand the context and the subject, I hope that they take on a new meaning. the last project I wanted to show you was my friend's twin daughters, Kham and Truden. And this helps illustrate something that I'm really interested in, a bit geeky. Part of the process is when you're taking a photograph is obviously choosing your subject and framing it, and it's that decisive moment. But a huge element for all photography is the edit, and I love a good edit. So over a series of shots, I'll have pulled back or come closer, and I've let the subjects get more comfortable, or even just the tilt of a head or a positioning of an arm can totally change the feeling of a shot. And it's totally personal. Obviously, there's no right or wrong. So it's just what shot moves you more, or which is more emotive. From these two shots, it was rather contentious in my household because my husband preferred one and I preferred the other. So just out of interest, a show of hands, who would have chosen the long shot, the full shot, closest to me on the right? 1, 2. Ah, so interesting, I was right. Take notes. So the project started in a really naive way, and they are the daughters of a friend of mine, and I just shot them because, photographing twins is just a really obvious subject matter. But I've continued taking their pictures over the last sort of 17 years, I guess. Shooting twins, it's perfect for photographers because the very notion of twins suggests the mirror-like rhetoric that photography has with the real world. And it's interesting when you shoot two subjects that are so similar, it also highlights how different they are and how we're all different from each other. So it was kind of a quite naive and obvious thing to shoot, but for me it's sort of become something different because I've shot them over such a long period of time. It's become this uninterrupted sequence, and it's a body of work in its own right now, and it marks the passage of time of how they've grown up, but also how the area has changed and how they've changed, and how, yet between them there's this continuity. So for me it's a really special project. Matt described my work as my project as a mix of nostalgia and realism, and I think that kind of hits the nail on the head, although I'd never been able to put it into words. My dad often jokes that he was born in the Bronze Age, and in the 20 years I've been shooting there's been huge changes. Everyone's on their phone when you go out for dinner. No one had mobile phones back in the day when I first started going back. Social media is massive in China. The villages around the monastery that we stay in are almost empty because everyone's moved into town. The families are much smaller, so where there used to be 8 children in a family, there's now 1 or 2. So the intake of monks and nuns has become less. So the culture's really changing. And I know it's unfair to want it to remain undeveloped because actually everyone's entitled to those changes. And I don't want it to, but I sort of feel like it's really important to hold on to the bits that I feel like are going. And the photograph itself is obviously an act of capturing a moment, but it's sort of my attempt at holding on to those things that I can see just disappearing and changing. I also realised in the last couple of years, when I've started to really have to engage in my work, that it's a bit of an attempt at understanding who I am and my connection with the place, because here I'm mixed Asian, white Asian, and there I'm sort of foreign Tibetan, so I'm not really either. And with no remaining pictures of my grandparents or the 8 uncles and aunts, I sort of look for them, the people that we lost, and also like a deeper sense of who I am in the surviving family. That's my aunt, and their children and their grandchildren. So I've kind of come to the understanding that it's okay I'm not this hard-hitting photojournalist. I found my own way of communicating in a more sort of quiet way. And when I was prepping, I saw this Alex Soth quote, and I thought it really rang true for this project, as it's taken me about 20 years to produce. I'm sure a lot of people in this room know how hard it is to find the balance between doing something creative that you're really passionate about and also paying the bills. And so for me, I worked in a photography agency, but I shot in Kham, and I continued shooting, and it meant that my photography didn't ever have to meet the needs of a client. So this project has been a really slow burner, but it has worked for me, and I guess I'm saying that if you're working on something, it's just worth working on, because those labour of loves, those personal projects really become something special for you, if not anyone else. And this book is a culmination of many projects, and it's like a love letter, an homage to the people that I hold most dear in a country that I just adore. And originally I really wanted to do like a hard cover, beautiful, weighty book. But I never felt the project was ready, and I realised I just had to get it out there. So I released this, and it's sold out, which is incredible. And but I hope it will have many more incarnations. So yeah, that's it.